about water baptism. They can be found in Matthew 3:13-16, Matthew 28, verse 19, Mark 16:16, Luke 3:7, verse 21, Luke 7:29, John 4:1, Acts 2:38-41, Acts 8, verse 12, 13, 38, and 39, Acts 9:18, Acts 10:48, Acts 16, verses 15 and 33, Acts 19, verse 5, Romans 6, verses 3-5, 1 Corinthians 1, 15-17, 1 Corinthians 15, 29, and Ephesians 4, 5. In those 16 passages, water baptism is referred to 23 times. Only 23 times. Yet for 2,000 years, the church has dogmatically taught that every true disciple of Jesus Christ must be water baptized on the basis of 23 references in the entire New Testament. And none of us would question the importance of water baptism, even with the minimal number of verses that address the subject in the New Testament. And what is even more amazing is in those 16 passages and 23 references, there is not a single verse to give us practical instruction about how to water baptize people. Not one single verse that gives us practical instruction. You would think as something as important as water baptism would come with a lot of instruction, but there's not a single verse in the New Testament giving us instruction about how to water baptize people. But hold on, what about communion? Well, if you study the entire New Testament, you will find there are 7 passages with 28 references to the subject of communion in the New Testament, and those references can be found in Matthew 26, 26-29, Mark 14, 22-25, Luke 22, 19 and 20, John 13, 2, Acts 2:42, 1 Corinthians 10, 16-21, and 1 Corinthians 11, verses 23-33. That's it. Those are all the verses in the New Testament that deal with the subject of communion. Yet we believe in communion. We practice it dogmatically with heartfelt faith. None of us want to miss a communion service because we believe in communion. And no one would argue about the vital role that communion plays in the church, and it has played a central role in the church since the day of Pentecost. But as amazing as all that is, it's even more amazing to me that in all of those references, there is not a single verse that instructs us how to serve communion. You would think a subject that important would come with a lot of instruction, but there's not a single verse in the New Testament instructing us how to serve or how to receive communion. That is difficult for me to imagine. Something as central to our faith as communion, coming with no practical instruction. But now, let's go to the subject of spiritual gifts. If you count all the verses in the New Testament that address the subject of the gifts of the Holy Spirit, which include fivefold ministry gifts in Ephesians chapter 4, motivational gifts were listed in Romans chapter 12, and the 9 gifts of the Holy Spirit, which are listed in 1 Corinthians chapter 12. And if you count all the verses that give concrete instruction about the gifts of the Holy Spirit, how to operate with the gifts of the Holy Spirit, how to conduct them decently and in order in the church, you will discover in the entire New Testament, listen to this, there are 103 verses. 103 verses on this subject scattered throughout the New Testament. They are found in Romans 1:11, Romans 12:5-8, 1 Corinthians 1:5-9, 1 Corinthians 12:1-31, that's an entire chapter. 1 Corinthians 13:1-13, that's another entire chapter. 1 Corinthians 14:1-40, that's another entire chapter. Ephesians 4:11-13, 1 Timothy 1:18, 1 Timothy 4:14, 2 Timothy 1:6, Hebrews 2:4, 1 Peter 4:10 and 11. All of those places contain 103 verses about the gifts of the Holy Spirit and practical instruction about how to cooperate with them. So let me sum it up. 23 references about water baptism, 28 references about communion, and 103 verses about the gifts of the Holy Spirit, which means the New Testament is filled with explicit teaching about the gifts of the Holy Spirit, even providing practical guidelines about how they should operate in our lives and in our congregations. 1 Corinthians chapter 14 is 40 verses devoted to the practical instruction about how the gifts of the Spirit ought to operate in your life and in your church. And it is amazing to me that there's not a single verse in the New Testament about how to conduct water baptism or how to carry out communion, but there are 103 verses filled with instructions, practical guidelines about how to partner with the Holy Spirit's gifts in our lives and in our churches. So what conclusion can we draw from these comparisons? It means, listen, statistically, the New Testament addresses the operation of spiritual gifts. Please listen to this. Statistically, the New Testament discusses the operation of spiritual gifts 4 times more than the subject of water baptism. Statistically, the New Testament addresses the operation of spiritual gifts almost 4 times more than the subject of communion. Those statistics should speak volumes to us about the importance that God places on the gifts of the Holy Spirit and the role that the gifts of the Holy Spirit ought to have in our lives and in our churches. It is just amazing. Now, we believe in communion, we believe in water baptism, we practice them with deep reverence based on 23 references, 28 references, and yet the gifts of the Holy Spirit, which are referred to in 103 references, many people look at them as though they're not necessary, or maybe they are optional. There's 103 verses dedicated to this subject in the New Testament. And if people would look objectively at the number of scriptures that address spiritual gifts, as compared to the scriptures addressing water baptism and communion, they would reach the conclusion that the gifts of the Spirit should carry at least equal importance to these other two practices that are regularly carried out in the church. Now, let me tell you, friend, God is a good steward of everything, including space in the New Testament. And if the gifts of the Holy Spirit were going to pass away with the death of the apostles, as I had been taught when I was a young man, or if spiritual gifts were less important than other subjects mentioned in the New Testament, why then would God commit so much space in the New Testament to this subject? It is totally illogical that God would include so many verses on this subject if He knew the gifts of the Holy Spirit were going to pass away, that they were going to be short-lived, or if He thought they were optional. He simply wouldn't do it. God is a good steward of everything, including the space in the New Testament. And the very fact that God allocated so much space to this subject meant that God believed this subject was very important for you and for me. Again, the New Testament addresses spiritual gifts 4 times more than water baptism, almost 4 times more than communion. And God would not commit so much space in the scriptures to this issue if it was an optional question. God expects the gifts of the Holy Spirit to be in manifested abundance in the church for the duration of the church age. God expects for these manifestations to be in your life and in your congregation. God doesn't want us just to know about Jesus intellectually. God knows we need the gifts of the Holy Spirit because it brings the reality of Jesus to us and right into our congregations. It confirms the testimony of Jesus among us. Wow. So we have to open our hearts to this work of the Holy Spirit. And that is why Paul said in 1 Corinthians 14, verse 1. Hear it again. Follow after love and desire spiritual gifts. You would not argue with the first part of that verse that says follow after love. You know that you're supposed to walk in love. You know that you're supposed to follow after love. If you believe the first part of the verse, then you have to also embrace the second part of the verse. If the first part is true, the second part is true. And the second part says, desire spiritual gifts, which means just like you are supposed to follow after love, you are supposed to desire spiritual gifts. And the word desire again means enthusiasm. It pictures passion, devotion. It depicts an eagerness to achieve or to possess something, to be fervently boiling with zealousness for the object desired. It pictures an intense desire that causes one to seek something until it is obtained, which means Paul was saying follow after love and desire spiritual gifts until you have them manifested in your life and in your church. We are supposed to desire spiritual gifts. Now, I know you want to do the will of God, and this is the will of God explicitly stated in 1 Corinthians 14, verse 1, follow after love and desire spiritual gifts, which means we've got to actively pray for and actively desire spiritual gifts